Open my lips, O Lord, and my mouth shall proclaim your praise. Amen. 6 weeks ago, I stood before you just as I stand before you today. It was Ash Wednesday, the start of the season of Lent. Everyone was gearing up for the next 6 weeks. For some, the season of Lent is a time to give something up. For others, Lent is a time to take on a new spiritual practice. Then there are some for which Lent is just an annoying 6-week period in which we are not allowed to say the A word. As we come to the end of Lent, I must offer all of you my congratulations for getting through what many consider to be the most difficult season of the church year. However, Lent is not over yet. 6 weeks ago, I asked you a question at the end of my Ash Wednesday sermon. It is a question I will repeat here because it warrants being asked more than once. Have you rendered your heart to God? Maybe your answer is, well, yes, of course. Maybe your answer is, yeah, I think so. Or perhaps your answer is, I don't know. Whatever your answer is, we can all agree that to render your heart to God does not come naturally or easily. In fact, we frequently get distracted by life and forget to render our hearts to God altogether. This is why Lent is so important. Lent asks all of us to take a step back, examine our life, and reassess where our heart is. Is it with God, or is it somewhere else? And then, as a follow-up question, what can I change in my life that will help me render my heart to God more fully? These are heavy questions and demand being asked at least once a year. What's so frustrating about Lent is not the fact that we can't say the A word. What's so frustrating is that no matter how many things we give up or spiritual practices we take on, our hearts can never be fully rendered to God. Our hearts can never be fully rendered to God because we are human and we are flawed. However, God knows this, and we know this. The real danger arises not when our hearts aren't fully rendered to God. The real danger arises when we don't realize that our hearts aren't fully rendered to God. Because when we don't realize that our hearts aren't fully rendered to God, then we run the risk of believing the opposite to be true. We run the risk of believing that our hearts are fully rendered to God. Today, on Good Friday, we see just how severe the consequences can be when a group of people not only holds, but acts on the belief that their hearts are fully rendered to God. For the Pharisees, chief priests, and other conspirators who plotted against Jesus almost 2,000 years ago are the prime example of such a group of people. They truly believed that their hearts were fully rendered to God, and they acted accordingly. And the result was the death of a sinless man. 2,000 years ago, the Pharisees and chief priests passed judgment on Jesus based on a lie. They had lied to everyone, particularly themselves. It was a lie that went back generations and was deeply embedded into their culture. So deeply was it embedded into their culture that it had never been questioned or examined. The lie that God was on their side because they had rendered their hearts to God. These conspirators, as I call them, had devoted their entire lives to upholding God's law, so of course God was on their side, right? And if devoting your entire life to upholding God's law isn't rendering your heart to God, then what is? Or at least that's what they thought. Jesus, on the other hand, constantly challenged them in what they believed to be God's law. There was absolutely no way that God was on Jesus' side. Think about it from their perspective for a moment. To the Pharisees and chief priests, Jesus was an anomaly. His methods were strange, his words were contradictory to theirs, and his actions drew way too much attention for their liking. And yet the people loved him. He was a threat to them in every way. He threatened their way of life as the exemplary upholders of the law, but he also threatened their very existence. It was only a matter of time before Jesus' popularity caught the attention of the Romans, and that was the last thing they wanted. Something had to be done. It was in everyone's best interest that Jesus die, right? Better one man dead than an entire nation. These conspirators believed that they were saving God's chosen people by crucifying Jesus. After all, God doesn't want to see his people destroyed by the Romans, nor does he want to see his law openly opposed. When you consider the perspective of the Pharisees and chief priests, their decision to crucify Jesus almost makes sense. No, scratch that. It does make sense until you consider one very important detail. Jesus was the Son of God, the very same God who they had devoted their entire lives to. And yet they could not recognize God standing right in front of them. The Pharisees and chief priests never questioned whether their hearts were rendered to God. They just assumed it. However, somewhere along the line, they had forgotten who God was and had rendered their hearts to another. In fact, it had been so long since they had examined the state of their hearts that even the sight of Jesus healing the sick, casting out demons, and transforming water into wine did not stir them. Their hearts were not nearly as rendered to God as they thought. What about you? When asked, have you rendered your heart to God, how does your first response compare to what actually is? The Pharisees and chief priests thought their first response was the only response. Yet they were wrong. They were wrong about a great many things. However, they were right about one thing. The Pharisees and chief priests thought they were saving God's people when they sentenced Jesus to death on the cross. And they did save God's people, just not the way they expected. Amen.